Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I am back on my book of nonsense, but hopefully in the spirit of the season. We've just had the winner of the 2022 Booker Prize, and so I thought it might be quite fun to look back on the sort of where are they now of 5 years ago. So the 2017 Booker Prize shortlist, and it's really interesting for me just to sort of think about this, partly because I think sometimes when we look at the shortlists that we've got this year, or even the long list, some of these books we're like, yes, these are exactly the right books for the shortlist. Sometimes there are ones that we think, oh, actually, a really big major book from this year has been excluded in some way. And actually, that's kind of what I want to do here today, is look at 5 years down the line, do we remember some of these books, and do we kind of still champion those authors in quite the same way? So yeah, let's just get on with it. So just before I start talking about the books that made it onto the shortlist and start going through those shortlisted books themselves, I wanted to actually very quickly touch on the books that didn't quite make it and were on the long list but didn't make the shortlist. And actually, weirdly, this is the list arguably where even more of these sort of big hitters come up. So for example, we've got things like Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, which won a Pulitzer and has been a sort of a big classic in many, like modern classic in many ways. We've got authors like Zadie Smith in there, Camilla Shamsi, who won the Women's Prize with Home Fire, Arundhati Roy, really big authors here. John McGregor, another pretty big author, and at least Reservoir 13 being one of his biggest books. We've got a slightly smaller book in some ways, Mike McCormack's Solar Bones, which won the Goldsmiths, but is, from a smaller press and maybe sort of, hasn't kind of hit these big kind of same things as in some ways, isn't as well known an author, but nonetheless was an author who won the Goldsmiths and all those sorts of things as well. And then we also have Sebastian Barry with Days Without End, a book that has also gone on to be incredibly successful. The follow-up book to this won the Costa Prize. The long list, weirdly, here is, I think, where some of the bigger authors lay. And there's a whole other discussion, I think, there about whether that's a really exciting or a really bad thing. I'm going to go for the side of it being an exciting thing, because I think, generally speaking, if you've got a shortlist that's just big names, it sort of maybe doesn't feel quite like it's announcing brand new fiction in quite the same way. Whereas I would say, having a chance for lesser known books to kind of make their way up the pile can be quite a good thing, and quite a healthy thing, really, as well. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on to this shortlist. Another thing to state here, really, as well, is that this shortlist is maybe the least geographically diverse that we've had in a little while. Of the 6 books that made the shortlist, we have 3 authors from the US and 3 authors from the UK, with Mohsin Hamid being the only one who has a sort of a dual nationality here, sort of being from the UK and Pakistan. But what that means is basically we have 3 writers who hold US citizenship and 3 who hold UK citizenship, and that doesn't feel particularly like a broad spread in this list. But even then, the long list only had a couple of people who were from outside of those places as well. So there we go. But we had George Saunders win with Lincoln in the Bardo, and I have to say, sort of almost right off, this is one of my favourite Booker winners of all time. One of the, I think, one of the most interesting and exciting books I've read in the last sort of 5 years. So I'm very glad that this book won. And looking at the rest of the shortlist, even though I have other books I really enjoyed, I can't see any other book being a winner apart from this book. Lincoln in the Bardo is a really quite experimental and quite odd book in some ways, but it basically follows Lincoln sort of mourning the death of his son and the sort of loss of his son, and particularly him sort of as he sort of starts to fall sick. And we kind of get this sort of polyphonic tale, really, where we've got lots of different voices. I think the audiobook for this had something like 50 different actors voicing characters, because that's how sort of spread out it is. And at times it almost feels like you're reading a weird sort of play, because kind of characters are sort of have their speaking bits and there are all these interlocking voices. But I devoured this book. I read it in probably probably about 2 sittings, I think. And I loved every single moment of it. I remember being on a bus, sort of like, it must have been like 11 o'clock, and I was just on the way back from seeing a friend, and I was like, I need to finish this book because I can't. I hate the idea of leaving 50 pages to pick up tomorrow. I was in the rhythm of the book, and I just needed to be in that moment. I just remember being sat at a bus stop, kind of like I'd got home, basically, was just waiting to quickly finish this book before I moved on. I think it's stunning. For me, this is such a beautiful tale of loss and of grief, but also about these sort of real things of sort of private versus personal, private and personal sort of versus public tragedies. So while Lincoln is battling the sort of public opinion of him, he's very privately dealing with this grief that he does not know what to do with. And it's a real leap of imagination, I think, for George Saunders to write it. But probably the easiest 5 stars I've given out in my life. I think I was just like, this is one of the most stunning things I've ever read. So I think for me, this really holds up as a winner. I read it a couple of years ago and just adored it. Yeah, this for me is up there with some of the best winners we've had for the Booker Prize. So I think very rightly done here. And let's go on to the rest of the shortlist. Next up is a bit of a chunker. This is Paul Auster with 4321. A book of about 800 pages or so, which basically sort of does almost like a sliding doors style approach to fiction. So it takes the idea of one character and how his life might have changed if some of the circumstances were slightly different. And so we basically, throughout the book, have the chapter split up into these 4 characters. So we've got 4 versions rather. So 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. And there are some times where parts of them are left blank because there are certain things happening to a character where we sort of almost can't check in on them for various parts. But in the midst of this, we kind of get the wide expanse of US history going on. So we've got things like JFK being shot. We've got things about war and Vietnam and how the various characters interact with this. So for one character, one version, his hand is damaged and so he's not able to serve in Vietnam, and how that sort of changes his life trajectory. So yeah, it's a really interesting book. I will say it's a difficult one for me because there's so much that I enjoy about the writing of this, and I find it quite compelling in lots of ways. But I almost sometimes do feel like the length counts against it a little bit. And not to knock big books just for being big. Sometimes, if you're really enjoying it, more of a good thing can be nice. But I think my issue with it is a little bit at times. I would have been really intrigued to see what a 300 or 400 page version of this would have done, or what it would have looked like if there were only 2 or 3 versions of this character being split up. But I think at the same time, it does something quite interesting in terms of capturing this grand scheme of, or sort of lifetime of a character, and how small changes would have made a big difference as well. So a really interesting book in this midst, and probably the one I would say that feels almost the most bookery in that sense, in terms of being the sort of grand historical book as part of it. Next up, we have History of Wolves by Emily Fridlund, the 3rd of our US authors on this list. And this book I spoke about recently in a weekly roundup, and I didn't fully get on with it, but I am really willing to give it another chance because I feel like there was something that I just missed, particularly as I mostly sort of read this as an audiobook. But essentially, this follows a character through her childhood, and we also get kind of flash forwards to the current day, and particularly looking at how sort of a few fairly traumatic events sort of have really shaped things. We've got things, for example, like in the school, one of the teachers having been accused of abuse, and we've got various other things that go on. And in the midst of it, she is writing a report on the history of wolves, and there's this sort of, she's almost this kind of character who's trying to engage with the adults around her and trying to kind of understand them. She almost doesn't really feel like a child in quite the same way. She's one of those sort of slightly precocious children in some ways who needs the sort of validation of adults. And in some ways, but we follow this sort of whole life sort of watching how these two sort of moments intersect, the current day with her as an adult and sort of trying to process some of the things from when she was a child, but also looking back at some of these moments from when she was younger. And this book at times is really quite lyrical and quite punchy, and I think that's maybe sort of sometimes where it fell down for me, was the lyricism of it I thought was gorgeous. But then I think I sometimes got lost on what was actually happening in the story. I also do recognise that as a me problem, because I was listening to this as an audiobook and I was also tired and busy, so I was probably listening to this in sort of 20 or 30-minute snatches while I was walking between places, which isn't the best for a book that feels like you just need to sort of give into it. But nonetheless, a really interesting addition to this list, and probably from the 6 authors here on this list, the one who I suppose at least I have heard a bit less of since. So maybe a really good thing, for an author so early in her career to have this little boost as well of being on the shortlist. And now we go on to the Brits. So we first have Mohsin Hamid with Exit West, and this book is a really interesting kind of approach to so many things. I really did enjoy this overall. I thought it was really quite clever in what it did. So the key sort of focus, I guess, of this is that in the midst of violence and quite a lot going on, we have this almost sort of magical thing that starts happening where portals start opening between worlds. And so therefore, in the midst of some pretty horrendous sort of acts of terrorism and sort of abuses of power and all these sorts of various other things, particularly kind of touching on things like immigration and refugees and what have you, we have characters who are able to escape in some variety. And sometimes that escape feels like a really positive step, that characters are able to sort of move quite freely across the world in a way that's quite borderless, and that therefore feels like a really interesting commentary on this whole thing around refugees, of what happens if, this sort of renders some borders completely pointless. But also, sometimes fleeing leads to danger, and so we've got these characters who are trapped in the middle of all of this. And particularly at the heart of this, we have a couple who are sort of desperately trying to hang on and look after each other and understand each other. They're very newly sort of together. There's a lot that they don't really understand about each other, and religion plays an interesting part in that, in terms of their perception of their gender roles with each other and where they can and can't break free of them. And so there's a lot of where characters in this book are just trying to escape anything that they can, and therefore these portals feel like a version of that. But ultimately this book is so sort of drenched in that sense of fear and danger that I think we get these really interesting descriptions of their lives. And there's almost something about having that magical realist element, or sort of more fantastical element to it, that allows us a bit more of a chance to go into the ins and outs of things like the refugee crisis or migration or what have you, whatever else. And I think this book has sort of stood up quite well. And Mohsin Hamid as well has been an author who's continued to release books. His book, The Last White Man, was one I thought might be actually on this year's list. And so really interesting to kind of see 5 years on whether this shortlist sort of stacks up in that respect. Next up, we have Fiona Mozley with Elmet. And I, again, covered this recently in a weekly wrap-up. This book I adored. I think this is such an interesting book in so many ways. So largely the idea of it is sort of focused on a northern town and a group of characters who are in this sort of strange power imbalance with the world and with everything around them. We have, for example, a group of travellers, people from the travelling community, and there is a really interesting discussion that comes up with that about people who have lived and worked on the land for years and years and generations, and they can trace their family back so far in relation to this land. But then there's an interesting discussion about what landlord rights mean in respect of that. So actually, somebody coming in and saying, well, I've got a bit of paper that says that this land is mine and you need to get off it, then leads to some very strange power imbalances where people are sort of saying, well, this is where I'm from, this is who I am, this is where I belong. You can't just evict me because I don't have the right bit of paper, but by law you can. And that also sets up some other situations where, for example, this sort of tough guy in one of the the traveller community is sort of set up and basically embarrassed publicly by being made to be the sort of the lackey almost of this landlord, with the idea of, well, if your son signs these documents, he owns the land and it's all fine, but in return I need you to do one thing, which is to fight for me in boxing matches to make me some money. And there's this humiliation that goes on with that, and particularly there's this sort of other character, the sort of the daughter, who is this sort of tomboy like character, and there's a sort of queer subplot that goes on there with her as well. And I just think it's such an interestingly done book. It has such a strong sense of place and of community. It's really lyrical without being sort of over the top. I think there's a real rootedness to this book that feels really deeply English and very deeply belongs to the place where it's written and the place it's about. But also whilst exploring this whole notion of who owns the land, who owns the UK. I just think it's fantastic, and it was really exciting to see another debut author on this shortlist, and one who has then gone on to release another book, Hot Stew, and which I really want to read. But yeah, very, very exciting to see this book getting some extra love, particularly as it was from a relatively small press and was a book that hadn't been as widely known outside of this long listing and then shortlisting. And last but not least, we have the shortlisting and the last ever and potentially ever shortlisting for Ali Smith with Autumn. And I say last ever because Ali Smith has sort of in recent years requested that she's no longer submitted for the Booker. I believe partly because of the rigmarole of going through the press tour and everything, but also partly to open it up for other authors on her, from her publisher to be considered. And Ali Smith has won lots of other awards, so maybe doesn't feel the need to keep being shortlisted for this. But Ali Smith, no stranger to the Booker Prize, this was her 5th shortlisting. And Autumn particularly was the beginning of the seasonal quartet, which was a real achievement, I think, in writing, of really chronicling some very weird times in UK history, some really unprecedented and difficult and wild times in UK history, with Autumn being seen as the first Brexit novel. This book came very soon after the Brexit referendum. It was written in an astonishingly short amount of time, and the whole quartet is sort of trying to keep up with all of the trends of what's coming up at the moment. So summer finishes on, just as COVID-19 starts to rear its head. And so you've got this really interesting set of British history being captured here. And nobody does it like Ali Smith, I think. Autumn tells the tale of several characters as they sort of go through life, but particularly in this book was a relationship between a younger woman and an older man, and their sort of friendship as it blossoms and as they learn more about each other. And I think what kind of is unveiled throughout this book, and particularly through a lot more of the quartet, is the there's a sort of there are a lot of hidden histories and hidden stories going on that really are oversimplified by things like the Brexit vote. So, whatever your feelings on the referendum, a lot of the narrative around the discussion of it in the UK was very much, it was very binary. People were really very divided over this. Families stopped talking over how they voted. But actually, we've got, a character who can trace parts of his family history back to being from other European countries and facing persecution and fleeing. But actually, he's sort of seen as being, just a British guy now, and that almost oversimplifies the relationship between countries and how many people have this sort of much deeper history. But I think at the heart of it, Ali Smith's sort of playfulness and silliness and real poignancy really come through. And so I think of all of these 6 books on this shortlist, this is probably the one that's had the longer lasting kind of appeal, partly because it's part of a series. But I would say, although Lincoln in the Bardo has gone on to have a much sort of, a really big thing as well, partly as the winner, but also partly, it's sort of stuck in the imagination as a book. I think something like Autumn, it was so interesting to see somebody so cleverly and succinctly analyse the political situation in the UK and understand that this is incredibly uncharted territory for all of us, and to kind of watch how it sort of moved from there on out. So I think it's a little masterpiece of a book, this one. So that is our shortlist, and we've got these 6 books. I mean, like I said, I think Lincoln in the Bardo, I still think is absolutely the right winner. I think it still stood, the last 5 years. I think you can look back and still think of it as a very solid winner, at least in my opinion, because I adore this book. But also so great to see Autumn and Elmet on the list, and even the other 3 that I liked but maybe not loved in quite the same way. So History of Wolves, Exit West, 4321, still really interesting books that really wrangle with a lot of the big historical and political issues going on around them. And that feels very Booker, and also very much like books that will sort of have longer lasting reaches. But I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, whether you've read these books, whether you've sort of read some of them, or kind of anything else, or even any other big books that were kind of big omissions that year. Quite frankly, looking back, it is quite weird to see the Underground Railroad not on the shortlist, because that feels like, that was such a big book. And, maybe again, there's a case to be made about, other authors getting a chance because that wasn't shortlisted. But still, really interesting regardless. I've been Bob the Bookerer, back on my Book of Nonsense because 'tis the season. Take care and speak to you all very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.